Okay, there should be a Blandings turtle right now, and I'll pull up my presentation. Is that coming up for everybody? Okay, good. So hopefully my internet connection is good. It is supposed to be high speed. So if you do have any troubles, I don't see everybody on my side screen, but I do see Ruth and Susan. So you can give me a little bit of this, that there's some trouble, or that everything's going well. So I want to thank you for having me here to talk today. I have been lucky enough to again receive funding from Nature London to do some of this work, which is extremely important for a project like this. And you know, for those who've heard me speak in the past, you may see a few similar slides, but I want to give a background for some of the folks that maybe haven't seen me talk or need a refresher on some of the work that I do. And I will start off by just showing a little bit about me as a kid. So this is something that has been in my blood since I was very young. We always had nature around my house in Princeton, a little farm community in Ontario, and it was always me saving turtles off the roads or at wetlands that were being drained. And so there's no surprise why I'm doing what I am doing now. So again, I count myself pretty lucky to have been able to play in the mud with turtles from 6 years old now, and my 47th year still in the mud playing with turtles. At the age of 19, I was able to get a contract to canoe the entire Thames and the entire Sydenham River in order to search for spiny softshell turtles, along with Michelle Fletcher, who is now the aquatic biologist at Upper Thames. So we've been able to stick it out for many years, and both ended up still at the Conservation Authority. And it's one of those things that in 1994, we didn't know a lot about the spiny softshell turtle. And so it was an opportunity to see where they were, what they were up to, and some of the threats that might be impacting these animals. And over the years, we developed the project to include a lot of other species. So 1994 was the first year, but by 1997 or so, we were working with queen snake and a few other species. And by 2001, 2002, I incorporated multiple species, from spotted turtles, Blandings turtles, hog-nosed snake, milksnake, and a number of other species, because what we found is that all these species were facing the same problems, the same threats were causing their decline and or harm in some way or form. So if we could better the situation for all these animals, we're obviously going to be impacting other species as well. So not only reptiles are positively impacted from our recovery efforts, but also birds, mammals, insects, etc. So in Ontario, there are 26 native reptile species, 17 snakes, 8 turtles, and 1 lizard. 18 of these species are designated as at risk, both federally and provincially. 7 of our 8 turtles, 10 of our 17 snakes, and our only lizard. However, the federal government now shows that all 8 of our turtles are now at risk. So our provincial listing and our federal listing is a little bit different, but for the most part, the majority of our reptiles, especially our turtles and our snakes, are at risk. So I won't dwell too much on how the listing works. I think most people understand how this system is. Not at risk, that's a good thing. Extinct, that's a very bad thing. And most of our species in Ontario, reptile species that is, fall in the middle between special concern and extirpated. So approximately 61% of the world's 356 turtle species are threatened or already extinct, and Canada is not immune from the threats that impact turtles worldwide. So turtle life history especially is a pretty serious thing to think about when you consider the threats that are now here because of people. So we talk about turtle life history versus the modern world. So turtles have a late age of maturity. It may take up to 20 years for some species to lay their first clutch of eggs in Ontario. There's very low juvenile to adult recruitment rate, meaning very few young reach maturity. Adults of some species may need 50 to 80 years to replace themselves in the population, since many nests fail, most young are eaten. And since these animals can live for many decades, in some cases over 100 years, you would think that would be a benefit to them, but that evolution is only effective if those animals can reach those great ages. So they need to replace themselves in the population by living a long time and producing a lot of eggs until finally some of those do survive. So great age and maturity, if they were very reproductively successful every year, maybe we'd have too many turtles, but that's obviously not the case. So fewer turtles are now reaching maturity. Many turtles are hit on roads. They have shortened lives because of road mortality, hunting, persecution, and many other threats. Fewer nests hatch and fewer young reach maturity because of subsidized predators such as raccoon, coyote, fox, and skunk. Habitat fragmentation and loss can directly impact populations. It can also prevent opportunities for animals to expand their range. So, one I guess example of that is our 400 series highways. In some parts of the province, there's no animal that's going to get across them, and with the exception of a handful of culverts beneath them, very few animals are reaching opposite sides of that road. So we do see very real fragmentation on the landscape from roads, but that can also come from agriculture or cities or many other factors. Climate change is now resulting in major problems for turtles as well. It includes changes to incubation temperatures, flooding, drought. We're getting more extreme storm events that have major repercussions for many of our wildlife species. It can create more erosion, it can create more drought, it can create extreme heat that prevent eggs from hatching, and a lot of water courses are now drying up and in some of our hottest times of year. So some very real issues with climate change. So I'll give you an overview of some of the species that we work with and their status here in Ontario and in Canada. And I always like to start with the snapping turtle. They are listed as special concern. They're very important species for our wetland environments. They're the turkey vultures of our wetlands. They eat a lot of the dead stuff, dead ducks, dead frogs, dead fish, and they help keep these these ecosystems clean. They also create burrows into the mud, which allow for tadpoles and fish and a number of other species to seek refuge during low water times. And the eggs and young are food for a number of other species here in Ontario and throughout their range in North America. On the opposite end of the spectrum in both size and I guess in threat is the spotted turtle. They are listed as endangered. They're a very small species, very beautiful species. And because they're rare, because they're beautiful, because they're small, all make them very susceptible to illegal collection for the pet trade. The individuals that you see here in these photos, I have to keep well-guarded secret of where they exist because they will be collected for the illegal pet trade. And some of these animals could range from $250 to over $2,000 for an individual, depending on which part of the world they get smuggled to. So a very real threat for some of these creatures. Blanding's turtle, which is a species that is not well represented, neither is the spotted turtle in the Upper Thames River watershed, but they do exist in small numbers. The Blanding's turtle is threatened, provincially, endangered federally, and they have a very high domed shell, black with yellow flecking, and they have a hinge along the lower part of the shell, and it allows the shell to close up like a drawbridge in order to protect itself from predators. And they need this protection because they do spend a bit more time on land than some of our other turtle species, and they will do some big journeys across farm fields and even forests. Northern map turtle is one of the Thames River species that we see quite often in the city of London. So many Nature London folks have probably seen this animal basking on rocks down from Richmond Street or off the Walk Bridge in Gibbons Park. And they are listed as special concern, and basically, we know there's a problem. There's not as many as there used to be. There are fewer I guess, incidences of reproductive success. So that's part of the reason that they are listed as special concern. They get their name map turtle because they have a series of yellow contour-like lines on their shell. And you can see here in the picture on the left that the male is significantly smaller than the adult female. And so you can imagine that breeding and courtship is a very gentle display in this species. And it's thought that the females are larger because they need to carry eggs, but we don't see this across the board when it comes to all turtle species, but at least in spiny softshell turtle and in map turtle in Ontario, the males are significantly smaller than the female. They are prey specialists, especially the adult females, feeding mostly on mussels. So they use that large jaw and really unique characteristic inside their mouth, which is thick pads of keratin in order to crush mussel shells for part of their diet. They will utilize the non-native zebra and quagga mussels, but again, we don't know the impacts of filter feeding mussel and the bioaccumulation of toxins, and if an animal is focusing their diet on an already impacted species with a bioaccumulation of toxins. So the spiny softshell turtle, again, is the one that I started working with in 1994 when I was 19 years old. So 28 years later, I'm lucky enough to still work with them, but unfortunately, they are endangered. They went from threatened to endangered, and we have seen population declines across the board in Ontario. In the past 20 years, we've seen losses of up to 50% of breeding females at some North Shore of Lake Erie populations. And we were seeing a downward projection or trajectory along the Thames River, Sydenham River as well. But I will talk about a bit of hope and some success that has changed that, at least on the Thames River. So they get their name because they have a soft shell, but they also have a long tubular snout. And as I mentioned, the male is much smaller than the female. You can see on the center lower photo. But again, they get their name because of that leathery shell. And they also have a series of spines across the back of that upper shell behind the neck. And those spines don't really protect the animal in any way. And most females that you find, those spines or tubercles have been worn down. And the males generally have a rough texture instead of tubercles. And they have a very reduced lower shell. So what this turtle lacks in protection from a hard shell, it makes up for with speed. So the spiny softshell turtle, in general, softshell turtles worldwide are known as the fastest turtles in the world. And the spiny softshell turtle here in Canada is no exception. And but in order to, I guess, defend itself or protect itself from predators, it uses speed, but it also uses camouflage, and it will quickly bury into the sand in order to hide from predators. And at the very last moment, and you'll see in the following video, that the turtle will bury down into the sand in shallow water, and at the very last moment, they'll do a shimmy back and forth, and it allows the substrate to lay over top of the shell of the turtle in order to conceal it. So hopefully this video is playing for everybody. So we see that turtle quickly go into the substrate, but if you give it a second here, and it's kind of hard to tell with the glare, but you will see the shimmy at the very end, right there. You can see that turtle shimmy back and forth, and that allowed the substrate to cover the back of the shell, making it very hard to detect where the turtle went in. They are very fast, as mentioned, and here's an example of a male being released after processing.
That's great.
So that soft shell means you don't want to stick around very long when times get tough. So a species that we've been working with since about 1996 is the endangered queen snake. It's a type of water snake, and it is also a prey specialist that relies almost solely on freshly molted crayfish. It exists along the Thames River. It's a river and stream species and occasionally a marsh species. So there are a few records from the St. Clair National Wildlife Area, the tip of Long Point, as well as the tip of the Bruce Peninsula. But the majority of queen snakes are found along rocky rivers and rocky streams. So the Thames River has been an important spot for this species. They were historically known from about 25 areas in Canada. They're down to about 15 spots, and they appear to be in relatively low densities. We've had some additional success in recent years. We've been monitoring the species for again, a number of years using mark recapture techniques, which includes microchipping the snakes. And we found that they do move a little further than we thought they did. And we have found a man-made drain that is now home to a sizable population. So we are going to look in more detail about how that drain was created and how we can replicate that for future recovery efforts. So this was the third year, or second year, I should say, of studying that new population. And we're learning quite a bit, but there are a lot of threats because it is a drain. People are there, and the water quality is not necessarily going to be great. The eastern hog-nosed snake, a threatened species here in Ontario. Again, another animal that we have been working with for quite a few years. They do exist in parts of London, as well as a big population outside of London that we focus a lot of our efforts on. And they are a big snake, and they can look pretty intimidating. They will swell up their neck to kind of look like a cobra. They will come in a variety of different colors and patterns. You can see the melanistic form on the top right. On the top left, a form that almost looks like an eastern fox snake with the yellow and black, and various other forms in between, from orange to red to gray to all green to all brown. This snake can confuse people because they do have all these color patterns and incredible defenses. So they will gape their mouth, they will swell their body up, they will hood their neck up, they will release a horrible smelling musk, and if all else fails, they roll over and play dead, which is an absolutely incredible thing for a snake to do. You don't see this too often in the reptile world, but our eastern hog-nosed snakes have mastered this. However, when they come across a wild turkey, this play dead routine does not always work for them, and they are still often attacked by wild turkeys. But I will say, when we are doing research with hog-nosed snakes, sometimes when you handle them, they do the play dead routine, and it makes it a heck of a lot easier to measure them. So they lay perfectly still with their tongue hanging out, and they just watch you while you process them. And we try to do this as quickly as possible because we know they are under some stress. So we want to get them in and out as quick as possible. So another species that often gets confused for Massasauga rattlesnake is the milksnake, or eastern milksnake. And they are, unfortunately, like most of our snakes, killed out of fear. And persecution is one of the biggest threats that many of these snakes, or that the snakes in general, face, in addition to road mortality and habitat loss. But the eastern milksnake is a very beautiful species. The young ones have a bold red blotched pattern, and as they get older, that turns to more of a brown pattern. And they will vibrate their tail and sound similar to a rattlesnake in grasses, which again gives people the idea that they have found a rattlesnake in their backyard, and more commonly based on our calls in people's basements. If I get a call about a snake in someone's basement in the spring or fall, or even in the winter, I can almost guarantee it's always going to be a milksnake. They're masters at finding their way into old foundations and through people's basement windows to try and seek shelter for the winter. You know, occasionally you'll get a garter snake doing that, but most times it is the milksnake. So we do have a study going on with the milksnakes. So we do use microchips like you use for your cats or dogs. And when you handle milk snakes, they will defend themselves. And at first I hesitated putting pictures like this on because people have this fear of snakes biting, but this snake and snakes in general will only bite when you grab onto them. They are not going to seek you out. And I would too. If I had no arms or legs and someone grabbed me mid-body, I would do anything in my power to defend myself. But if you look at the picture on the right, you will see that this bite is pretty tiny, and I have had much more severe bites from puppies. So if you have a fear of snakes, I hope you have a fear of puppies. So I will give you an example of how scary the bite of a milk snake is. Here it looks intimidating, but when you see my staff, getting bit, everyone thinks it's the funniest thing in the world because the snake is trying his best and he can't really do anything. But the one funny thing about milk snakes is, if you are a snake biologist, when you capture a milk snake, unlike other snakes, usually a fox snake or a garter snake, they're really defensive at first and they will try and bite. And then they calm down and they're good for the rest of the time that you have to process the animal. Milk snakes, however, will sometimes be defensive initially, then they'll calm down, and right when you think you're about finished processing, they will just bite you. So they're like a jack in the box, and I always surprise you, hence the reason everybody is laughing. So why are reptiles declining? Well, there's a number of reasons, and I'll go over a few of those here. Road mortality is a huge one. It is one of the biggest threats to reptiles in Ontario and in Canada right now. You know, if we look at habitat loss, sure, habitat loss was probably the biggest issue, but moving forward and into the future, there's not much more habitat that can be lost. It is still happening, and sure, habitat loss is still a threat, but the biggest current threat, if you set aside habitat that's already been lost, is road mortality. They intersect all of our natural areas. They border all of the farm fields and grasslands and anything that you can think of, people want to drive to, and roads have been created. So, you know, people put up wildlife crossing signs, and that's great, but just like the deer crossing signs, after a while, people kind of forget they're there and don't pay as much attention. And a good example here is on the Long Point Causeway. This is a Blandings turtle, one of hundreds that have been killed along that road over the years. And so many get killed that they even get paved over when the next paving schedule occurs. So a pretty serious issue. But not only do we have accidental road mortality, but we have intentional road mortality. And you can see here the vehicle drove off the road over the Midland painted turtle. That's a close-up on the bottom, but it also happens to our endangered spotted turtles. I watched the car intentionally run over this animal. They drove off the road onto the white line and then back up onto the road after hitting the turtle. We also have it with snapping turtles. I've taken out the most gruesome photos in order to save people from ruining their Friday evening, but it does happen. And this was an adult female that was laying eggs. And you could see, although this happened long before I got there, probably a few days before, that you could see still the track from the truck off the road, up over the turtle, and back up onto the road. And this sweet girl, I won't show you the other photos, but I watched as an individual almost ditched his truck trying to run her over, crushing her shell, and she was still alive for a very long time as we tried to find a vet to euthanize her. And it's unfortunate, but this is something that still occurs. Some other threats that we have to deal with in Ontario and Canada, North America, and around the world is poaching, angling, persecution, target practice with guns, yes, and boating. So angling is an ongoing issue with turtles, and every year we get multiple animals with hooks. You can see a snapping turtle in the top left, a softshell turtle in the top right, a painted turtle where you can't see the hook in the mouth, but you can see it coming out of the eye. And in the bottom, you can see a softshell turtle with a hook in its mouth that was bludgeoned to death when it was brought to shore. So there's a lot of folks that aren't like the rest of us, and sometimes it's hard to imagine we're all part of the same species, but this is something that we have to think about and deal with. A few examples of some of the other threats that I talked about. In the top left is a snapping turtle skull with a bullet hole. The middle is a boat propeller injury across the skull of a snapping turtle. The top right was a snapping turtle that was shot in a pond. And the bottom right is a turtle that was bludgeoned to death along the pathway of the Thames River in Claley Meadows. And the bottom left is an interesting one because that turtle that I showed you right here that I watched get killed, once she was put down, we just put her remains in the ditch. We didn't know what else to do. And I went back a couple months later and I retrieved her skull. And that's her skull in the bottom left. And you can see this hole in the side. And what's interesting about that is that we found bullet fragments in her skull. So she had, and what's more interesting is that the skull had healed or started to heal up around that bullet hole. So this turtle was shot in the head, survived, and then was intentionally run over probably a few years later. So you have to wonder how many attacks on some of these animals' lives that happen in their lifetime of 50, 60, 80, or 100 years. Legal collection is also a big one. I mentioned spotted turtles can go for hundreds to thousands of dollars across different parts of the world. There's large pet markets in Europe and Asia and other areas, and of course in the United States. And it's thought that spotted turtles have brighter and more spots in Ontario than they do in the US, so they are targeted. And again, just a few news articles of some of the issues that impact these animals to do with poaching. So disease is another issue. This is a fox snake afflicted with something called snake fungal disease, which can prevent them from feeding or even seeing. And there's also issues of viruses such as herpes virus and ranavirus that have been found in Ontario turtles now. And these can quickly kill an animal. And there's some worry that it could decimate populations, though we need to do more research. So we send all of our dead and dying turtles to the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative for study and investigation pathology to see what has happened to these animals. So improper farming practices are also an issue. The picture that you see here is one of our top spiny softshell turtle nesting sites along the Thames River. And from 1860 until 2015, this was the predicament that spiny softshell turtle nests were in. So basically all of the nests were lost due to compaction, and any of the turtles that were in the shallow water near the cattle would be crushed. Luckily, and I won't go into too much detail about this later, so I'll mention it now, we were able to purchase this property from the landowners in order to protect it, and it is now, again, one of our top nesting sites for spiny softshell turtles along the Thames River. Invasive plants, another serious issue. On the left, you see Japanese hops. On the right, you see Phragmites australis, or European reed, and both of those impact turtle nest sites. Phragmites more so for spiny softshell turtles anyway, along the north shore of Lake Erie, and wilder Japanese hops along the Thames River, though we're seeing more and more Phragmites within the upper Thames watershed as well, and that impacts queen snakes and a number of our turtle species. So Phragmites australis, or European reed, is a non-native that is overtaking everything from ditches to ponds to massive coastal marsh areas in the Long Point area and along southern Lake Huron. It gets taller than any of our native plant species that would normally exist in those wetland littoral zones. And as you can see here, it's a pretty terrible, thick monoculture. And it's difficult for me to walk through. And this isn't even the most thick stand that I go into. So there's very little options for many of the animals that are forced to live in these situations. So I've set up a series of photos here. In 2003 is the photo on the left. The exact same spot as 2013, 10 years, and the marsh habitat went from sedge, native grasses, lily pad, and a few other species, to a monoculture of Phragmites, which had very few opportunities for basking for these animals and for feeding. The biodiversity in these Phragmites sites drops considerably, and so there are very few insects, very few snails, very few frogs, etc. But the unfortunate thing is that even Phragmites control can be a threat to some of these animals. And we have found at some of our sites that Phragmites control has led to some pretty serious changes to the bit of habitat that remained for some of these animals. And it also resulted in injury and mortality of many animals. So you can see on the top, there is a snapping turtle with a broken upper shell, broken jaw, broken legs, a Blanding's turtle in the bottom right that was crushed by machinery, a spotted turtle with compaction injuries. So it's a no-win situation when it comes to being a turtle. And I always joke around that, and I don't think it's too funny, but it's one of those things. If reincarnation is such a thing, don't come back as a turtle. It's a pretty tough life. So habitat loss. So we've talked about existing habitat loss, and this is something that's occurred over the past 200 years, where we've lost most of our wetlands in southwestern Ontario, and many or most of our woodlots as well. And if you look at the distribution of converted natural areas in southern Ontario, which is in orange, it basically is the same area where we find the bulk of our turtles and snake species. It's southern Ontario from Ottawa to Windsor, and that's where all of our turtles exist for the most part. And you can imagine the number of threats. So in the handful of areas, I don't know if my cursor is visible there, Long Point National Wildlife Area, Rondeau Provincial Park, Point Pelee, Kettlestoney Point. So there's a few areas that don't show a lot of orange, but historically they have still had heavy forestry practices. Point Pelee was an orchard, and it has thick, non-native species there now. It has DDT still in the soils. So we've impacted even our protected natural areas historically. And if you look at any map from above, you can see it is an area of Canada that has been so heavily manipulated. Basically, it's a crosshatch of roads and agricultural lands. And not saying that we don't need agricultural lands. Obviously we do. We need our farmers, we need our farms, we need to eat, but we need to keep in mind that we need the connections and the green space in order to maintain wildlife diversity and maintain human health. But again, if you look closer and closer, you can see all of these plots of land subdivided by either fields or roads. And as we look closer, you'll sometimes even see woodlots remaining, which is fine, but these are small bits of woodlot, often filled with non-native species, ponds that have been mowed to the edge, and all of these areas divided by roads. So it's not the same place it once was. And again, just some aerial photos. And here in the city of London, gabion baskets and concrete walls and old dams. So there's a lot of manipulation from humans that have reduced the amount of habitat that remains for many wildlife species. And on a more, local example in the Upper Thames River watershed, I'll talk quickly, again, just as an example of our perceptions of habitat and habitat loss. So if we look at Dorchester Swamp from above, it looks like a pretty big natural area just east of London. However, as we get closer, we can see that there are some pretty serious issues surrounding Dorchester Swamp. And obviously it's divided into 4 quadrants by roads, and 401 being one of those roads, which is a very serious issue. So if we look at it again, we can see that many of these are under different land ownership, and you can't control what other people do with their land at all times. And if we try and look at just Dorchester Swamp again without the divisions of ownership, we can see that there is a road allowance that could mean expansion of roads and highways. Of course, the yellow line is the 401, but there's also that buffer that I've put in blue, and some of these areas are still impacted by salt and antifreeze and oil and gas and all the things that come off all the vehicles that use these areas. If you put a border around the nearest properties, you can obviously guess why some of the periphery of these woodlots might be impacted by people because of dogs and cats, because of garbage being dumped, because of non-native species that come in from the fields and the areas, as well as people moving in through some of these spots. Of course, you get big sections of non-native species that come up in some of our natural areas, and people like to create trails. And that's not exactly where these trails are, but there are a lot of social trails. So this tells you and shows you that even though we have these natural areas, they're not free from human disturbance. So not only has the area around them been lost, but the integrity of some of these natural areas is failing. Another good example, although outside of Upper Thames River watershed, is Rondeau Provincial Park. So if we look at Chatham, Kent, and we can see it has been heavily impacted by people. There's very little forest cover, but we see what we think is this beautiful gem, and it is. in the bottom corner, and that is Rondo Provincial Park. So we take a little closer look, and you can see this sand spit and these wetlands have been created over hundreds to thousands of years and created an amazing feature for wildlife, and it has been protected. But how protected is it really when we consider the large number of trails that have been put in, the large number of buildings that have been put in, the campgrounds, the roads? And again, if we take a closer look, that some of these very important areas, especially the eastern side, which should be black oak savanna and some very sensitive habitat for skinks and fox snake, nesting opportunities for turtles, as well as flying squirrels and migrating birds. But as we get closer and closer, we see a lot of these areas have been so heavily manipulated, and every one of these cabins has a trail down to the beach. And again, this is very critical habitat for wildlife species in a protected park. And I will say that I believe it was this house, maybe the one before, where I found this back in 2000. And I knocked on the door and I asked the individual, I said, "Did you know you have a dead eastern hog-nosed snake on your front stump?" And he said, "Yeah, I killed it." He's like, "I didn't want my kids to be scared, and my neighbors hate snakes." So this is in a protected area. This is a protected species. And I asked him, I said, "Do you know it's at risk and it's protected here in the park?" He's like, "Yeah, but the fewer of those, the better." And this was the attitude of one of the cottagers in the park. So if we can't protect them in a provincial park, they stand zero chance in what is by far an area that has been devastated in terms of natural habitat outside the park. So what are the solutions? Well, science and conservation obviously are going to play a role and have to play a role. You want to collect long-term data. You need to have that data for effective recovery. You need to do detailed surveys as part of long-term research programs. And you need to do habitat creation and rehabilitation wherever and whenever possible. So habitat creation can include building snake hibernation sites, creating brush piles, ensuring movement corridors between green spaces. You want to look at population sizes, movement, habitat selection, threats, and behavior. I'd mentioned that we microchip many of our snakes, and we also microchip softshell turtles, and we use a small microchip or pit tag, same that you use for your dog and your cat, in order to permanently mark these animals so we can track them for their lives. And unfortunately, pit tags are passive, so you have to recapture the animal in order to scan them. But we do also use radio telemetry equipment or radio tags. And you can see some spotted turtles on the left, softshell turtles on the bottom left that we fitted with radio transmitters so we could follow them to see where they're going, how far they're moving, what types of habitat they're using. And some very important information is gained from this in order to protect these animals over time. So data collection is key. We want to see these animals over the long term. You can see everything from x-rays to find hooks embedded in turtles and keeping tabs on injuries. And in general, just growth, size, age, all of this plays a role in us understanding these animals. And that allows us to then understand how to better protect them. So I'll give you a case study of spiny softshell turtle and some of the recovery work that we've been doing. So turtle nest and nest site loss is significant. We found that 99 to 100% of nests were being lost due to predation. So we saw that flooding, cattle, horses, ATV use, camping and fires, poaching, foot traffic, drought, subsidized predators, invasive species, climate change, the list goes on. If I were to take away half of these threats, we would still lose the majority of nests. The situation is that severe. So again, I talked about Japanese hops earlier and how it impacted turtle nests. So spiny softshell turtle nest along the Thames River, it was completely covered with Japanese hops. So when we did our early surveys in 1994, and I should mention this, is that we found predominantly only adult animals. We didn't know if the young were using a different type of habitat. We didn't know if maybe nests were not successful or young were all being eaten. We didn't know what the situation was. So it took a couple years before we realized that all of the areas that these turtles had to lay, because they are floodplain nesters. Softshell turtles don't like going to upland habitats like snapping turtles do. They like to be very close to the water to lay their eggs. But non-native species were covering these sites. So we decided, okay, we're going to remove all this vegetation and create a plot of land for these animals to lay their eggs on. So we didn't know if it was going to work. So we removed the Japanese hops and we piled you can see the dark area in the center there that's being raked. This small area was piled up with about 12 or 14 inches of gravel and sand. And within 24 hours, we had our first nest. And by probably about 3 weeks, we had 30 nests on this tiny little plot. So what that told us is there was a lack of nesting opportunities for these animals, and given the chance, they would use what you created. However, we suddenly realized that all of these nests were predated by mostly raccoon, but also coyote, fox, possum, and in the past, even domestic dogs have dug up nests. And in some areas, skunks predate heavily on softshell turtles and turtle eggs in general. So we needed to think about how we were going to solve this problem. So we started putting cages around the eggs, and we thought, well, this is a great solution. And we realized very quickly that poaching, people saw the cages and they dug up and stole hundreds of eggs. And also flooding for the eggs that weren't found by poachers, they were being lost because the eggs drowned underwater. So softshell turtles, because they are floodplain nesters, they've evolved to be able to withstand 12 to 24 hours of flooding, and the water comes back down and most of the eggs are generally okay. But with climate change and with the effects of Fanshawe Dam on the Thames River, the flow rates are higher for longer periods of time, and we lose the majority of our nests and the majority of the eggs drown. So we really had to think things through, and it took quite a while, but from 1994 to about 2006, we tried caging and we had some success, but it wasn't until we started removing all eggs, bringing them to our incubators and artificially incubating eggs in the lab that we saw true success and a big difference and a big jump in the numbers of eggs that we had hatching. So obviously in our situation, in 60 days, we'll have turtles hatch out, which is good. And we can then release those animals earlier in the season. Hopefully that gives them a head start in order to put on weight before the winter. And the more turtles in the environment, the higher chance of getting these animals to maturity. So there's a couple strategies you can use. You can either head start an animal, a few animals, grow them up to a size that there's a less chance of them being predated, or release as many young hatchlings as possible and let natural selection still occur. And the odds are still that some of these are going to survive and the strongest will reach maturity. So because softshell turtles are kind of not nice to one another after about 2 weeks in captivity, that you would need multiple large enclosures to raise them up to a size to head start. They will bite each other's shells and necks and feet and cause serious damage. So it is better for us to release them into the wild right off the bat because we have big numbers. If we were only releasing and only found maybe 10 or 20 hatchlings a season, we would try and head start them. But because we're able to release hundreds to thousands, that's our goal. And this, very hard to look at unless you have a big screen series of numbers, is our success. And I didn't put the work from 1994 to 2001. I've just started in 2002 to make it easier. So to give you an idea of how our success has changed, in 2002, we protected 41 nests and we released a total of 221 baby turtles. In our best year, which was 2017, we protected 406 nests and released 6,576 spiny softshell turtles. So the transition year, 2002 to partway through 2007, we were still caging nests. And we started bringing some in to artificially incubate in 2007. And from 2008 on, we only incubated in our lab. So our hatch success jumped from a range of 10 to 59%, to consistently around 90 or more percent each season. So we've been very successful, very lucky to have, been able to do this. So we've now released over 46,000 hatchling spiny softshell turtles since 2002. So I talked about 1994, our surveys, and the surveys for the years soon after 1994, we were only finding adult animals. Now we have animals of all age classes. We have the small young from the previous year and every size up to adults now. We have young females now using our nest sites, and we never had that in the past. And it's not for probably another 10 years before we'll really see the big numbers that we've released and protected over the past few years. And that's where we should be able to see a jump. But we've already been able to prove and see the jump in the number of nests and the number of turtles that are out in the environment. So part of conservation is also education. So we do the science, but we also need to reach out to the local community. We want to provide presentations and displays. So we go out to schools, we go out to community groups. I do talks such as this in order to get people involved and people excited about turtles, about reptiles, about this group of animals that's often left behind. And sometimes you find people that you would not expect to be great conservationists. And here's an example of a construction crew that saw a female snapping turtle nest, and they walked off the job despite what their bosses said, and said they would not do the work until this turtle nest was protected. So I got called in, and they actually helped remove the eggs, and they were so excited to know every detail about what we did and to see the young once they were hatched. So again, you never know who your allies are going to be in the world, and this group of great guys really showed me that you can't judge a book by its cover. We also, speaking of books, we also provide a couple of books. I wrote The Stewardship of the Spiny Softshell Turtle in 2005. Alistair Mackenzie and I did the Photo Field Guide to Reptiles and Amphibians in Ontario in 2015. And these resources help people get interested and excited about reptiles. We rely heavily on the media in order to really showcase the work that we do and show reptiles in a positive light. And we've been able to do that multiple times. We've been able to get on the front cover of the London Free Press many times, as well as the Stratford paper, the Woodstock paper. And we've had really good allies with the media to help, I guess, educate and inform our local community. And again, it's not just myself, but there's a slew of people that have made this project successful. Everyone from adults to kids and everybody in between. And we've been able to really see a difference, especially in people's acceptance and understanding and concern for snakes. And the reason I put a series of two women and a girl with snakes is because when I used to do talks at schools, you'd mention snakes back, this is 20 something years ago, and you'd hear a lot of oohs. And to be honest, it was a lot from the young girls. But now when I do talks, I hear a lot of cool, that's amazing, and people wanting to learn more. And I get more young girls coming up to me than young boys now, which is a complete change over the past couple of decades. Very exciting. So my crews over the years have been exceptional, and I cannot thank them enough. They are the true heroes in all of this, because you can't do this work in isolation. You need people on the ground. You need people supporting you financially. You need people supporting you in many ways, like Nature London does for groups. And it's folks that put the effort in, sometimes without getting paid. Will Lyons, who's a longtime supporter of this project and was with Nature London. He has been since 2007 volunteering his time every summer to help spiny softshell turtles. So again, it's a lot of people that make a difference. This year and last year was tough though, because COVID obviously threw a wrench into things. So our HR department does not want us to have volunteers, and they were the heart of our project and our team. There would be me and 1 or 2 paid staff, seasonal staff, and the rest were all volunteers, and it was capacity building. It helped them build the experience for their careers, and it helped the project at the same time. But we've been able to make it work, and I must say that at the end, let me see. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So the team, again, it's not every day is about the negative side of things, that everything's declining and being lost. You have the good times with these people in order to make this work. So it looks like my presentation has frozen. Let me try and figure something out here. All right, so we're frozen. I'm trying to hit escape without success. So I'm going to stop share for 1 sec and then go back to it. I'm getting close to being done here, so hopefully let me figure this out for 1 sec. All right. So technology is great when it works. Working for everybody? Okay. So again, this year, it was just myself, Samantha, and Sean, and a handful of folks that worked for Upper Thames, and of course, Will, that were able to help out. So we were about 5 people less than we normally are in the field, and one of the hottest seasons we've ever experienced. So it was quite a unique situation. But we surveyed the Thames, we looked for nests, we found turtles, we marked turtles, and we did have some pretty incredible success. And let me So again, the amount of effort that goes into this project, I have hundreds of hours of bank time I'll never be able to use up, but it's a job of passion. It's a job of something that needs to be done that won't be done otherwise. And just like the folks in Nature London, if you don't volunteer your time, there's no money for a lot of this work. This stuff does not get done. But when you see the results of this from Blanding's turtles, Spiny softshell turtles, map turtles, Midland painted turtles, snapping turtles, and Eastern hog-nosed snake are all successfully in the native environment because of this project. And we're talking by the thousands, many of these animals. So a very significant effort. However, when you have a great amount of success, you also get a few odd things that happen. So one of our map turtle nests that we were contacted about from the public ended up being a non-native red-eared slider nest, which is an ongoing issue with these animals that are released. And also you can see some twin snapping turtles. The one on the right, that young twin didn't survive, but the larger one did. And on the bottom left, you can see a typically sized snapping turtle and 2 twins that both grew at the same rate and survived and hatched out of the egg together. We also had a 2-headed map turtle. Unfortunately, this poor creature only lived about 3 or 4 days, but it was our first one that's ever hatched out of an egg on its own and survived for any amount of time. So although it's unfortunate, it's probably best that this animal is not alive. You don't want to be probably in the environment in this situation because you're not going to last very long. And we also had albinistic snapping turtles hatch out. So we had 2 different nests hatch out with white snapping turtles. So they are at a higher risk of predation, but we have found adult snapping turtles that were albinistic in the wild. So we know that some do somehow find a way and make it. And luckily for snapping turtles, their shells often grow a thick coat of algae, so that will protect them to a certain extent. So I've left my final slide as my main research assistant for this year. So for many years, Kayla Orton from 2013 to last year was my research assistant who just really made the project run smoothly and was a gift in many ways. But of course, I cannot afford to keep someone on 12 months a year at a wage that is livable, because this is environmental work and it's reptile work. So this is the problem that you run into, is that your experienced long-term folks always need to find something so they can pay the bills. So Kayla, my friend, my research assistant, did move on, and she is now the water quality technician at Upper Thames, which is great. However, I had a volunteer in 2017 named Samantha Arevalo, and she was able to come back and fill the shoes of Sam. And the majority of the funding from Nature London went to this face you see here. She made this project happen this year. Without her help, I'd be dead on a gravel bar with heat stroke somewhere. Samantha, all 5'1" of her, she was so full of passion, so full of care, concern, and she is the person who is going to be making a difference in our world. She went back for her master's this past couple weeks, and I wish her the best. And she is so smart, so absolutely dedicated to conservation. And if it wasn't for Nature London's funding, she would not have had this opportunity. The capacity building opportunity would not have been there for her. So I want everybody that through Nature London that contributed to take a look at this happy face. And you made a difference to this project, and you made a very real difference to this young person in her growing career. So I will leave it at that for now. I could talk for hours, and I probably am way past my time, and I apologize. But you know, for anyone who knows me, I talk about wildlife like it is the only thing I have going on in my life, and sometimes I think that is probably the case. But I think I described it to a friend. It's nature OCD, and I think a lot of us can relate to that. That your world is surrounded by nature, whether you're planting a native tree, whether you're looking at a Wilson's warbler, whether you're investigating that spider in your backyard. There's always something to see in nature, and it's easy to become obsessed with it. So thanks very much for everyone. And on the way out, I'll just play a quick little video. And if there's any questions, I'll stop sharing once we get a couple hatchlings into the water here. Okay, so I'll stop sharing for now, and I don't know if there's time for questions or if there is.